The cistern lid came down for the first time on March 14, 1976, in Taos County, New Mexico, and by noon, the temperature had already reached 78 degrees, unusual for mid-March, even in the high desert. By evening, 3 separate neighbors had driven their pickups down the rutted dirt road to Eleanor Vasquez's 12-acre parcel to see what all the excavation was about, and by the following morning, word had spread through the valley that the widow from Oregon was digging herself a swimming pool in the driest spring anyone could remember. She was not, in fact, digging a swimming pool. What Eleanor Vasquez was constructing was a 12,000-gallon underground cistern lined with food-grade polyethylene, connected to a catchment system that would eventually cover 2,400 square feet of metal roofing, capable of harvesting approximately 1,500 gallons of water from every inch of rainfall. The neighbors did not know this yet, and when they learned it, they found the idea even more absurd than a swimming pool. Taos County received an average of 12.1 inches of precipitation annually, most of it arriving in brief, violent monsoon bursts between July and September. Every sensible person in the valley relied on wells, deep wells, drilled into the ancient aquifer that had sustained human habitation in this region for centuries. You did not catch rain in New Mexico. You drilled for water, paid for the drilling, maintained your pump, and prayed the aquifer held. The idea that a 54-year-old widow with no construction experience and a modest inheritance from her late husband could somehow capture enough precipitation to sustain herself through the brutal dry months struck her neighbors as the kind of fantasy that only outsiders entertained. They had seen outsiders before, artists and dreamers and back-to-the-landers, who arrived with grand ideas and departed within 2 years, defeated by the reality of high desert survival. They assumed Eleanor Vasquez would be no different. They were, as the subsequent decade would demonstrate, profoundly mistaken. Eleanor had arrived in Taos County in September of 1975, 3 months after her husband Martin's death, from a stroke that took him between one breath and the next, while he was repairing a section of fence on their small farm outside Corvallis. She was not running from grief exactly. She was running towards something, though she could not have articulated precisely what. Martin had left her the farm, $47,000 in savings, and a lifetime of memories she found too heavy to carry alone in the gray drizzle of Western Oregon. She had read about the high desert in a book borrowed from the county library, a slim volume about sustainable living in arid climates, written by a professor at the University of Arizona. The book had described ancient water harvesting techniques used by the Nabateans in the Negev Desert, by the Anasazi in the American Southwest, by communities across the world who had learned to thrive in places where rain was rare and precious. Something in those descriptions had resonated with Eleanor in a way she could not explain. She had grown up on a farm in eastern Washington, where her father had struggled endlessly with irrigation costs, had watched him study rainfall charts and argue with the county water board, had absorbed through childhood observation the fundamental truth that water was the limiting factor in dry country agriculture. Her father had believed and had told her many times that the future belonged to those who learned to work with the water cycle rather than against it. He had experimented with small catchment systems on his property, crude but effective, and Eleanor had helped him build them. Graded berms that directed runoff toward fruit trees, a small cistern behind the barn that collected water from the roof, lined swales that slowed drainage and allowed water to infiltrate rather than run off. These were not sophisticated systems. But they worked. They worked because they were based on physics, on the simple reality that water flows downhill and accumulates in low points, and that any surface can become a catchment if you design it correctly. Her father had died in 1962, and her mother had sold the farm, and Eleanor had moved to Oregon with Martin and spent the next 13 years believing that those childhood lessons were simply memories rather than blueprints. It took Martin's death to remind her that she had once known something important, something that most people had forgotten or never learned in the first place. The parcel she purchased was 12 acres of high desert scrubland at 7,200 feet elevation, covered in piñon and juniper and chamisa, with a gentle south-facing slope and a seasonal arroyo cutting across the northwest corner. The real estate agent, a cheerful man named Dennis Trujillo, who had lived in Taos County his entire life, had warned her that the property had no well and would require drilling, probably to 400 feet or more, at a cost of roughly $15 per foot plus the pump and pressure tank. Eleanor had nodded and written a check for the full purchase price of $8,500, and Dennis had driven away, believing he had just witnessed the first mistake in what would prove to be a long series of mistakes by another naive transplant. What Dennis did not know, what none of her neighbors knew, was that Eleanor had spent the previous 4 months researching water, harvesting with the same methodical intensity she had once applied to learning bookkeeping for Martin's small construction business. She had written letters to the University of Arizona professor who had authored the book that inspired her move. She had ordered technical bulletins from the USDA Soil Conservation Service. She had driven to Albuquerque to visit a man named Peter Warshall, who was working on rainwater harvesting systems and who spent 3 hours explaining the mathematics of catchment area, storage volume, and seasonal precipitation patterns. She had done the calculations herself, multiple times, using the rainfall data from the Taos weather station. 12.1 inches average annual precipitation, falling on 2,400 square feet of metal roofing, would yield approximately 17,940 gallons of water per year, assuming 75% collection efficiency to account for evaporation, first flush diversion, and system losses. A single person required, at minimum, share approximately 30 gallons per day for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene, call it 11,000 gallons per year. If she could store enough water to bridge the dry months between April and July, when precipitation dropped to nearly zero, she would have surplus. The mathematics were clear. They were not easy, but they were clear. The construction began in March of 1976 and continued through the following October. Eleanor hired 2 local men to help with the excavation: Roberto Espinosa, a 43-year-old stonemason whose family had lived in the valley for 6 generations, and his nephew, Carlos, a recent graduate of Taos High School who planned to attend the University of New Mexico in the fall and needed money for books. Roberto was skeptical from the first day, well, not hostile, but genuinely concerned that this outsider woman was wasting her money on something that would not work. He had grown up watching the acequia system that had irrigated the valley for centuries, had participated in the annual spring cleaning of the ditches, and understood water management in a way that was both practical and cultural. But acequias required rivers, and rivers required snowmelt from the mountains, and what this woman was proposing, catching rain from rooftops and storing it underground, seemed to him like trying to fill a bucket with a teaspoon. He expressed this concern on the 3rd day of excavation, standing at the edge of the pit that would become the cistern and staring at the dry red dirt they were removing. "Senora Vasquez," he said, "I do not wish to be disrespectful, but I have lived in this valley my entire life, and I have never seen anyone do what you are attempting. The rain here, it comes hard and fast, and then it is gone. You cannot hold it. It runs off before you can even see where it went." Eleanor had climbed out of the pit, brushed the dust from her work pants, and looked at Roberto with the patient expression of someone who has anticipated exactly this objection. "You're right," she said. "The rain comes hard and fast. That's why I need a catchment area large enough to capture it in the few hours it's falling. A 1-inch rainfall on 2,400 square feet of roofing delivers approximately 1,500 gallons of water. If I can move that water into storage before it evaporates, I'll have it for the months when nothing falls at all. I'm not trying to stop the rain from running off. I'm trying to redirect it before it has a chance to run anywhere." Roberto had nodded slowly, not convinced, but willing to continue working. He was a craftsman, and the stonework she was proposing for the cistern's interior collar was interesting work, regardless of whether the overall project made sense. By June, the basic structure was taking shape, and Eleanor had become the primary subject of conversation at Louis' Cafe, the diner on the state road where locals gathered for coffee and gossip. The structure she was building did not look like any house her neighbors had seen before. The south wall was constructed from used automobile tires filled with rammed earth, a technique she had learned about from correspondence with a young architect named Michael Reynolds, who was experimenting with similar methods in a canyon south of Taos. The tires provided thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night, reducing the need for heating fuel in winter and cooling in summer. The north wall was bermed into the hillside, insulated by 3 feet of earth that maintained a constant temperature year-round. The roof was standing seam metal, painted a light color to reflect heat, with precisely calculated slopes that directed all precipitation toward galvanized gutters, connected to 4-inch PVC pipes that fed into the underground cistern. There was no well. There was no connection to the county water system, which did not extend to her road in any case. There were no conventional plumbing fixtures. Instead, Eleanor had designed a greywater system that would route sink and shower water through a series of planted cells, filtering it naturally before releasing it into a constructed wetland that would irrigate fruit trees and a small vegetable garden. The neighbors, observing this construction from the road or during occasional visits ostensibly to welcome her to the valley, offered their opinions with varying degrees of tact. Margaret Sandoval, a 67-year-old widow who had lived on the adjacent property for 31 years, visited in late July and walked around the structure, examining the tire walls with an expression of frank disbelief. "Honey," she said, "I don't know what they taught you in Oregon, but this is not how we build houses here. Those tires are going to fall apart in 5 years. That metal roof is going to sound like a drum when the hail comes. And that water tank of yours, what happens when it freezes solid in January? You'll have a 12,000-gallon block of ice and nothing to drink." Eleanor had poured Margaret a cup of tea from a kettle heated on a small propane stove and explained that the cistern was buried 5 feet below ground level, below the frost line, and that water at that depth maintained a temperature between 50 and 55 degrees year-round, well above freezing. She explained that the tire walls would not fall apart because they were structural elements with compacted earth, not decorative features exposed to UV degradation. She explained that the metal roof would indeed make noise during hailstorms, but that the interior ceiling was insulated with rigid foam and would dampen the sound considerably. Margaret had listened, sipped her tea, and departed with the unmistakable air of someone who has just witnessed the early stages of an expensive disaster and is too polite to say so directly. If you're finding value in these stories of forgotten practical wisdom, knowledge that was once common but has been lost to time and changing circumstances, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel. Every subscription helps ensure that these lessons in self-reliance and innovative thinking continue to reach people who need them. The algorithm favors channels with engaged audiences, and your participation makes a genuine difference in whether this kind of content can continue. Now, back to Eleanor and her unconventional approach to water security in the high desert. The summer monsoons arrived on July 19th, 3 days earlier than average, announced by a towering wall of cumulus clouds building over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east. Eleanor had completed the catchment system only 2 weeks earlier, and she stood on her partially finished porch, watching the clouds approach with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. She had done the calculations, had verified the pipe diameters and slope angles with Peter Warshall during a phone call that had cost her $4.75 in long-distance charges, had tested each connection with a garden hose to ensure there were no leaks. But theory and practice were different things, and she would not know whether her system actually worked until water started flowing. The storm hit at 4:47 p.m., dropping 0.8 inches of rain in approximately 40 minutes, a typical monsoon burst, intense and brief and violent. Much Eleanor watched the first water hit the metal roof, watched it sheet toward the gutters exactly as she had designed, watched the 4-inch PVC pipes begin to fill. She had installed a first flush diverter, a simple mechanism that directed the initial flow of rainwater, which carried dust and bird droppings and other contaminants from the roof surface, into a separate 50-gallon drum rather than into the main cistern. The diverter worked. She saw it fill, saw the ball valve float upward and close the inlet, saw the cleaner water that followed begin flowing toward the underground storage tank. She walked to the cistern access point and opened the lid, shining a flashlight down into the darkness, and saw water streaming in from all 4 inlet pipes simultaneously, splashing against the polyethylene liner and pooling at the bottom. Which by the time the storm passed at 5:32 p.m., her cistern had gained approximately 1,100 gallons of water. She had lost some to the first flush diverter and some to splashing overflow at the gutter corners, design flaws she would correct before the next storm. But the system worked. The fundamental concept worked. She closed the cistern lid and stood in the fresh-washed air of the post-storm evening, breathing the distinctive smell of wet creosote and pinon, and allowed herself a small smile. It was not triumph yet. One storm proved nothing, but it was validation that the mathematics translated into physical reality. That was worth something. By October, the monsoon season had delivered 7.3 inches of precipitation, slightly above average, and Eleanor's cistern held 9,847 gallons of water. Ian measured precisely with a graduated dipstick she had fabricated from a wooden dowel and waterproof markings. Her house was not complete, but it was habitable, with the south-facing windows installed and the thermal mass walls doing exactly what she had predicted. During a cold snap in late September, when nighttime temperatures dropped to 28 degrees, the interior of her home never fell below 54 degrees without any supplemental heating. She burned a small amount of pinon wood in a cast iron stove for comfort, but the thermal mass provided the baseline. More importantly, she had water. Pure, clean water that tasted better than any municipal supply she had ever used, filtered through a simple sand and charcoal system she had built herself from instructions in a Volunteers and Technical Assistance manual. She was using, on average, 23 gallons per day, less than her projected 30 gallons because she had become increasingly efficient in her water practices, taking what she called Navy showers, wet, soap, rinse, and carefully reusing greywater for her small orchard of newly planted apple and apricot trees. At this rate of consumption, her stored water would last through February, even if no precipitation fell at all, and in northern New Mexico, the winter snows typically delivered another 3 to 4 inches of water, equivalent between November and March. She was not merely surviving, she was accumulating surplus. Roberto Espinosa, who had helped with the final construction phases and had watched Eleanor's system develop over 7 months, told his wife Lucia that the widow from Oregon was either a genius or a fool, and he was no longer certain which. The water is there, he said. I have seen it with my own eyes, but one good year does not prove anything. Wait until the drought comes, and then we will see. The drought came, but not immediately. The years 1977 through 1979 were relatively normal precipitation years for Taos County, with annual totals ranging from 10.8 to 13.2 inches, and Eleanor's system continued to function exactly as designed. She made improvements each year: better gutter guards to prevent debris clogging, a float valve that automatically shut off cistern inlet when storage reached capacity, an additional 3,000-gallon backup tank that she installed in 1978, using the remainder of Martin's savings. By the spring of 1980, she had become a minor curiosity in the valley, the tire lady with the rainwater, as some locals called her, but the curiosity was mixed with lingering skepticism. Her water system had not yet faced a genuine test. Northern New Mexico had not experienced a severe drought since the mid-1950s, and most of her neighbors believed that when such a drought returned, as droughts inevitably do in arid climates, Eleanor Vasquez would be loading her belongings into a truck and heading back to Oregon with her tail between her legs. They did not say this to her face, but they said it to each other, and Eleanor heard about it through Roberto Espinosa, who had become something of a friend despite his initial doubts. They are waiting for you to fail, Roberto told her one evening in February 1980, sitting on her porch and drinking coffee sweetened with honey from her 3 beehives. That is what people do here. We have seen many outsiders come and go, and the ones who stay are the ones who learn to do things our way. You have not learned to do things our way. You have invented a new way, and that makes people uncomfortable. Eleanor had nodded and poured more coffee and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Either her system would work when tested, or it would not, and no amount of discussion would change the outcome. The test arrived in 1980. The winter of 1979 to 1980 was exceptionally dry, delivering only 1.2 inches of precipitation between November and March, less than half the normal snowfall. The monsoon season that followed was worse. July brought scattered thunderstorms totaling 0.6 inches. Just August brought 3 significant storms that dropped 1.1 inches, but also brought devastating hail that stripped leaves from apple trees and shattered 2 of Eleanor's cold frames. September brought almost nothing, 0.2 inches for the entire month, the driest September on record for Taos County since weather observations began in 1895. By October 1st, 1980, the region had received only 4.7 inches of precipitation for the year, compared to the normal 9.8 inches that would typically have fallen by that date. The high desert, already adapted to aridity, began showing signs of severe stress. Pinon trees developed needle drop. The seasonal arroyo that crossed Eleanor's property, which normally flowed for at least a few hours after monsoon storms, remained dry all summer. The chamisa, usually golden with flowers in September, years produced only sparse and stunted blooms, and the wells, the deep wells that every sensible person in the valley relied upon, began to falter. Margaret Sandoval's well, which had produced reliably for 27 years, dropped from its normal 12 gallons per minute to 4 gallons per minute by August, and to less than 2 gallons per minute by October. She had to lower her pump 40 feet, at a cost of $800, and even then the water came up muddy and tasting of sulfur. Tom Benavides, who ran a small cattle operation on 200 acres to the south of Eleanor's property, watched his stock tank go dry in August and had to haul water from town, a 34-mile round trip that consumed most of a day and cost $45 per 1,000 gallons at the municipal filling station. The Romero family, who had farmed the same land for 4 generations, just watched their alfalfa turn brown despite running their irrigation pump 16 hours a day because the acequia that fed their fields had dwindled to a trickle as the mountain snowpack evaporated and the river dropped to historic lows. This was what drought looked like in the high desert. Not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow tightening, a gradual reduction of margins until there was no margin left. Eleanor Vasquez checked her cistern on October 3, 1980, and recorded 7,412 gallons remaining. She had used approximately 6,800 gallons since January, an average of 22 gallons per day, and had captured only 3,100 gallons during the meager monsoon season. Far less than normal, but still enough to partially replenish her supply. Her calculations, redone with updated precipitation data, suggested she had enough water to last through February 1981, even if no additional rain fell at all. The situation was tight, tighter than she had ever experienced, but it was manageable. She reduced her usage to 18 gallons per day by eliminating all greywater irrigation of her fruit trees, which would have to survive on whatever they could pull from the deep soil moisture, and by switching from daily to every other day showers. She reduced, but she did not run out. Meanwhile, 3 miles east, Margaret Sandoval was buying bottled water from the grocery store for drinking and cooking because her well water had become so mineralized during the low water period that it tasted of iron and gave her stomach cramps. Tom Benavides sold half his cattle herd at a loss because he could not afford to keep hauling water. And even so, he spent over $2,000 on water transport between July and November. The Romeros lost their entire second cutting of alfalfa and half their first, a financial blow from which they would not fully recover for 3 years. Across the county, domestic wells that had never faltered were producing sediment, failing entirely, or requiring expensive pump lowering and casing repairs. The aquifer, which had seemed inexhaustible to people who had been drawing from it for decades, revealed itself to be finite, still present, still massive, but dropping measurably during periods of extended drought when recharge failed to keep pace with extraction. This was not news to hydrologists, who had been warning about aquifer depletion in the Southwest since the 1960s. But it was news to the families who had built their lives on the assumption of permanent water availability. If this kind of detailed, practical historical knowledge is something you'd like to see more of, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment about water management practices in your own region. These stories only reach people who need them when the algorithm sees engagement, and your participation directly influences whether channels like this one can continue producing content. Every subscription represents a vote for preserving practical wisdom that might otherwise be lost. Now, let's continue with what happened as the drought deepened into 1981. November 1980 brought 0.4 inches of snow, barely enough to cover the ground, melted by noon. December brought 0.7 inches. January. 1981 was the driest January in 53 years of record-keeping, with only 0.1 inches of precipitation for the entire month. Eleanor watched her cistern gauge drop, 6,800 gallons on November 15th, 6,100 on December 31st, 5,200 on January 31st. She reduced her usage to 15 gallons per day, a level that required significant behavioral adjustments, sponge baths instead of showers, dishwashing in a small basin with immediate greywater recycling, drinking water rationed from a 5-gallon container she refilled weekly from the main cistern, to maintain awareness of her consumption. It was not comfortable, but it was sustainable, and more importantly, it was possible. She had water when her neighbors were running out or paying enormous sums to truck it in. She had water that tasted clean and pure, shared without the mineral contamination that plagued the struggling wells. She had water that cost her nothing beyond the original investment in her catchment and storage system, an investment that, she calculated in February 1981, had cost approximately $4,700 for materials and labor over the 5 years since she had begun construction. Tom Benavides, she knew, had spent over $6,000 on well-related expenses in 1980 alone, between the initial drilling, the pump replacement, and the water hauling. Margaret Sandoval had spent roughly $1,800 on well repairs and bottled water. The Romeros had lost an estimated $12,000 in crop value due to inadequate irrigation. Eleanor's initial investment was looking in retrospect like a bargain, and it was an investment that required almost no ongoing maintenance or operating cost, whereas wells required electricity for pumps, periodic maintenance, and occasional major repairs or re-drilling. The mathematics, which had always been clear in theory, were now proving themselves in practice under the harshest possible conditions. February brought snow, finally, mercifully, 2.1 inches of precipitation that fell in 2 separate storms and persisted on the ground long enough to provide genuine moisture to the parched landscape. Eleanor collected 2,340 gallons from these storms, bringing her cistern level up to 6,100 gallons and effectively ending any concern about running out before the monsoons returned. But the drought was not over. March was dry. April was dry. May was dry, except for one 0.3-inch rain that barely wet the soil surface before evaporating. June brought nothing at all. By the time the monsoons arrived in mid-July 1981, the region had entered what climatologists would later classify as a 2-year drought of moderate to severe intensity, comparable to documented droughts in 1934 and 1956, but falling short of the legendary drought of 1893 to 1904 that had depopulated entire villages in the Rio Grande Valley. The monsoons of 1981 were better than 1980 to 5.4 inches between July and September, but the damage had been done. 3 families in Eleanor's general area had abandoned their properties or sold at distressed prices. Tom Benavides reduced his cattle operation permanently, never rebuilding to pre-drought levels. The Romeros' oldest son left for Albuquerque to take a job with a construction company, the first time in 4 generations that a Romero had worked off the family land. Margaret Sandoval, at 69, told Eleanor during a visit in August 1981 that she was considering selling her property and moving to Santa Fe to live with her daughter, not because she had run out of water ultimately, but because the experience of nearly running out had shaken her confidence in the future. "I always believed the well would be there," Margaret said, sitting in Eleanor's cool, earth-burned living room while August heat shimmered outside. "My husband drilled that well in 1953, and it never failed us, not once, until last year. Now, I don't trust it anymore. I keep $100 in my purse in case I need to buy water suddenly. That's no way to live, looking over your shoulder at your own well like it's going to betray you." Eleanor had listened and poured Margaret cold water from a ceramic pitcher she had filled from her cistern that morning, and said nothing about mathematics or calculations or the principles of water harvesting. Margaret drank the water and commented on how good it tasted. No minerals, no sulfur, no iron. And then looked at Eleanor with an expression that contained something the older woman had never before directed toward her neighbor: respect. The transformation of the skeptics came gradually, not in a dramatic moment of collective recognition, but in a series of individual reconsiderations that accumulated over the months following the drought's peak. Roberto Espinosa was the first to approach Eleanor with a serious question about replicating her system on his own property in late September 1981, when the worst of the crisis had passed, but the memory was still fresh. He sat on her porch in the cooling evening and asked, with the careful precision of someone who had thought about this for weeks, how much such a system would cost and how long it would take to build. Eleanor had shown him her records, the material receipts, the labor logs, the progressive improvements she had made over 5 years, and had estimated that a basic system scaled for his family of 4 would cost approximately $6,500 and require roughly 300 hours of labor, which Roberto could largely provide himself given his construction skills. The payback period, assuming water costs of $50 per month for municipal supply or well maintenance and electricity, would be approximately 11 years. But the true payback, Eleanor emphasized, was not financial, but existential. It was the security of knowing that your water supply depended only on rainfall and your own maintenance, made not on an aquifer you could not see, or a pump that could fail, or a municipal system that could raise rates or impose restrictions. Roberto had nodded slowly, his face thoughtful in the fading light. "My father used to talk about the old days," he said, "before the wells, when everyone had a cistern behind their house for rainwater. He said his grandmother could tell you exactly how much water was in her cistern at any moment without looking. She knew from how much had fallen and how much she had used, like counting money in her head. We forgot that knowledge when the wells came. We forgot that water was something you had to think about every day." Eleanor had smiled at this, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in months. "That's exactly it," she said. "The wells made water invisible. You turned on a tap and it appeared. And when you stopped thinking about where it came from. But water doesn't come from taps. It comes from rain and snow and aquifers that took thousands of years to fill. When you catch it yourself, when you store it yourself, you can't forget that." The following years saw a gradual spread of Eleanor Vasquez's techniques through the Taos County area, though spread perhaps overstates the speed and scope of adoption. Roberto Espinosa built his cistern system in 1982 and 1983, working on weekends and evenings, with Eleanor providing technical guidance and helping him source materials at lower cost by combining their orders. His system was smaller than hers, 6,000 gallons of storage fed by 1,600 square feet of roof. But it provided approximately 70% of his family's water needs during normal precipitation years and 100% during good years, significantly reducing his dependence on the well he still maintained as backup. Margaret Sandoval did not build a catchment system. At her age, she felt the investment would not provide enough years of benefit. But she told her daughter in Santa Fe about Eleanor's approach, and her daughter mentioned it to colleagues at the State Environmental Agency, where interest in alternative water sources was beginning to grow in response to documented aquifer depletion across the Southwest. By 1984, Eleanor had received visits from graduate students in hydrology, county extension agents, architects interested in passive solar design, and representatives from several environmental organizations who were compiling case studies of successful rainwater harvesting in arid regions. She showed them all the same thing: her meticulous records, her cistern gauges, her 5 years of precipitation data matched against 5 years of consumption data, her cost calculations, her maintenance logs. She was not trying to sell anything or promote any ideology. She was simply demonstrating what she had built and letting the evidence speak for itself. The true legacy of Eleanor Vasquez's water system, however, cannot be measured in the number of direct imitators or the articles written about her approach. It lies rather in the gradual normalization of rainwater harvesting as a legitimate strategy for water security in arid regions, a normalization to which she contributed alongside dozens of other pioneers working independently across the American Southwest and around the world. By 1990, the year Eleanor celebrated her 70th birthday in the house she had built from tires and earth and captured rain, the New Mexico legislature had passed regulations explicitly permitting and encouraging residential rainwater harvesting, removing legal ambiguities that had previously discouraged adoption. By 2000, passive rainwater collection systems were included in the building codes of several Arizona and New Mexico municipalities, no longer viewed as eccentric experiments, but as prudent supplementation of conventional water sources. By 2010, the year Eleanor Vasquez died peacefully in her bed at the age of 89, rainwater harvesting had become sufficiently mainstream that commercial systems were available at home improvement stores. And several new housing developments in the Southwest incorporated catchment and storage as standard features. Her obituary in the Taos News, published on March 22, 2010, mentioned that she had been an early advocate of sustainable water practices, but provided no details about her system or its influence. By then, what she had pioneered had become unremarkable, simply one option among many for water-conscious homeowners. The neighbors had stopped laughing decades earlier, had in fact mostly died or moved away, replaced by a new generation that had never known a time when rainwater harvesting was considered eccentric. This, Eleanor had often reflected in her later years, was the highest form of success for any innovation. To become so thoroughly adopted that its novelty was forgotten, just so standard that no one remembered it had ever been strange. The principles that Eleanor Vasquez applied in 1976 are the same principles that inform modern Earthship construction, passive house design, and net zero water buildings today. Principles that were never really new, only rediscovered and reapplied after a century in which abundant and cheap water from wells and municipal systems had made them seem unnecessary. Water harvesting is not a technology. It is a practice, ancient and global, suppressed by modernity, and now returning as the limitations of modernity become apparent. The aquifers that seemed inexhaustible in 1950 are measurably depleted in 2024. The municipal systems that provided reliable water to sprawling southwestern cities are increasingly strained by population growth and climate change. The wells that Eleanor's neighbors relied upon in 1976 draw from the same water table that is now declining by inches per year in many parts of New Mexico, forcing farmers to drill deeper and pay more for every gallon. Against this backdrop of growing scarcity and rising costs, the simple logic of catching rain from rooftops and storing it for dry months looks less like eccentricity and more like common sense, exactly as Eleanor always maintained it was. She did not invent rainwater harvesting. She merely remembered it, at a time when most of her neighbors had forgotten, and she had the determination to implement it despite their skepticism. The drought proved her right, but she had known she was right before the drought came. That is not pride talking. That is just mathematics. If you found this story valuable, if it has changed how you think about water security, or inspired you to research catchment systems for your own property, or simply reminded you that practical wisdom often lives in the margins rather than the mainstream, I hope you'll share it with someone who might benefit. Every share extends the reach of these stories beyond the algorithm's preferences into the hands of people who are searching for exactly this kind of knowledge. The challenges Eleanor faced in 1980 are coming for more communities in the coming decades, and the solutions she demonstrated are still valid, still achievable, still waiting to be implemented by anyone willing to do the calculations and trust the mathematics. Your engagement with this content is not just support for a channel, but it is participation in a network of knowledge preservation that stretches back to Eleanor and forward to whoever watches this video next week or next year or 10 years from now. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already, and thank you for listening. The tire walls of Eleanor Vasquez's original house are still standing, maintained now by a non-profit land trust that purchased the property after her death and operates it as a demonstration site for sustainable desert living. The cistern, expanded twice since 1976 and now holding 18,000 gallons, continues to provide all water for the caretakers who live on site, just as it provided for Eleanor through 6 major droughts and 43 years of high desert residence. The records she kept, meticulous, precise, when spanning 3 decades, are now part of the permanent collection at the University of New Mexico's Center for Water and the Environment, where they are used to teach hydrology students about the real-world performance of passive rainwater systems under varying precipitation regimes. Roberto Espinosa's son, who took over the family property after Roberto's death in 1998, still maintains the cistern system his father built with Eleanor's guidance, and has expanded it to cover the metal-roofed workshop he added in 2005. The practice spreads from property to property, generation to generation, each installation a small act of memory, a practical refusal to forget what Eleanor's father once knew and taught her, what the Nabateans knew in the Negev and the Anasazi knew in Chaco Canyon, and every dryland culture has always known, that water is precious, that rain is a gift, and that the wise person catches what falls and stores it for the day when nothing falls at all. Eleanor Vasquez caught her water, stored it underground where it stayed cool and pure, and lived 34 years in a house that looked strange to her neighbors on the day she broke ground. The neighbors stopped laughing when the drought came. They stopped laughing because their wells failed, and their crops died, and their cattle grew thin, while Eleanor Vasquez walked calmly to her cistern, lifted the inspection lid, and measured 7,000 gallons of clear, clean water that had cost her nothing but foresight. That is how knowledge proves itself on the frontier, not through argument. Why not through credentials, not through persuasion, but through the brutal clarity of results when conditions turn harsh and the stakes become survival. What works, works. What does not, fails. Eleanor's system worked. It is still working, 48 years after she first closed that cistern lid and waited for the rain.